Can everybody hear me okay? I'm going to try not to move around a lot. Okay, so today we're going to talk about recipes and some key points, hopefully. That's me, that's where you can find me. Just some disclosures, some of the companies I've worked with publicly in the last year. Okay, so the main objectives today, we're going to identify key steps in recipe development, discuss how to develop recipes for different types of outlets, and talk about writing and critiquing recipes more professionally for a variety of platforms. So just by a show of hands, how many of you cook just kind of regularly? Awesome. How many of you do recipe development for yourself, like playing around in the kitchen for fun? How many of you do it for a work, like a paying or a blog or like a work professional capacity? How many of you want to do it in a work or professional capacity? Okay, awesome. Okay, so these are the three things we're going to go through today. What is a well-written recipe? How can you look at a recipe and know if it's done well, and how do you do one well yourself? So these are the three main topics that we are going to really focus on. So consistent, accurate, clear, is there a style? So when you're doing your own blog or your own personal way of writing recipes, it's just like anything that you would do, an article or you're writing something, you have to have a style, be consistent, and be clear. So kind of your signature approach. People know that when they look at your recipes, they're going to see it written X way, whether you spell out the word tablespoon or you use a capital T or TVSP is up to you. Just consistency is going to be important, and we're going to go through some of that. If you are doing something for a magazine, they most likely will give you tenets to follow. They'll have rules you have to follow. So then that becomes their signature approach instead of yours. If you're writing if you're a retail dietitian, you're doing something for the store. If you are at a university or a clinical setting and you're doing something for the hospital or for the school, they may be giving you rules that you have to follow. So that kind of is going to play into what you're doing here. What is your audience? What are the rules you need to follow for your style and your approach? So let's go through some basics. We're going to kind of walk through a recipe in the different parts. First one is the title. Is it just mac and cheese? Is it a healthy mac and cheese? Is it a creamy mac and cheese? Is it, you made a mac and cheese with cottage cheese? How many of you know what key search is? Okay, so if you are a blogger or you do things online, there's a tool called key search which will tell you what people are searching for and what your competition is. So if you have a blog and you want people to find your recipe, writing mac and cheese, no one's going to find you because you're fighting with epicurious.com and Martha Stewart and everyone else who has millions of followers who write mac and cheese. But if you write mac and cheese with cottage cheese, the people who are searching for mac and cheese with cottage cheese might have a better chance of finding you. Does that make sense? So these are all things to think about when you're doing the title also. What do you want to convey when someone sees what you are trying to put across as your recipe? So timing. You can put this in, you don't have to put this in. A lot of consumers enjoy seeing it because they like to know how long it's going to take them to prep and cook everything from the get-go. One thing I would say is put a buffer in. If it takes you 15 minutes to chop all the vegetables, it might take someone else who's not comfortable in the kitchen 10 or 15 minutes longer. So build in a buffer. Active time would be when you're actively doing something. You're actively chopping, you're actively sauteing, you're actively draining. You're doing something that involves movement and some sort of cooking. The cook time might just be, it's in the oven for 45 minutes. So that is not necessarily hands-on time. So when I am laying my stuff out for prep time and cook time, that's kind of how I think about it. I spend 20 minutes chopping and sauteing, and then it goes into the oven for 45. Those are the two separate times. And head notes. You don't always have to write these, but if you do, here are some examples and what we like to think about. So This is one, I just had a cookbook that was published yesterday, so this is one from there. So it's this riff on Tuscan-style beans gets robust seafood flavor from simmering the beans together with the shrimp. To keep the shrimp plump and juicy, we marinate them briefly before adding to the pan and cooking gently. Canned beans and other pantry staples make this dish fast and perfect for any time of year. So I am not a very flowery writer, so I tend to focus on things like it's got canned goods, so those are pantry staples, which to me, you're telling the audience that it's an easier, simple type of thing that you might have already available. I talk more about the actual process of the cooking. You could also say, I was in Tuscany, and this reminds me of a dish that I had, and I came up with this dish because of X, Y, or Z. So it just depends on who you are and what you want to convey, but the whole purpose of the head note is to describe the recipe in a way that makes somebody want to actually cook it, right? So you want them to read the title and the head notes and say, I want to make that. Also, this bottom part, any advice or warnings and substitutions, you can also in this part say, if you don't have white beans, you can use kidney beans. Or any advice, sometimes if I have something that's spicy, I'll put in the head note a way to make it less spicy for those who don't like spicy dishes. Yield, you need to make a decision about how you want to say this. So you could say makes 4 servings, you could say yield 4 servings. You could say how much is in a serving. So these are another thing for consistency. You make your decision and you kind of stick with it. And every time you make a recipe, you kind of follow it this way. Ingredients. So descriptive, list in order of use, which is by far the most important takeaway of today. Make sure your ingredients are in the order in which you use them in the directions. And commas matter. So let's go through some of these and I'll explain what I mean. So 2 tablespoons extra virgin olive oil, comma, divided. What that means is you will have a total of 2 tablespoons of oil for the recipe, but divided infers that you will use different parts at different times. So I would have to say then in the directions, use 1 tablespoon for X and later on 1 tablespoon for Y. So that comma divided implies that you will use that whole amount and split it up at different points during the recipe. 1 large shallot, comma, diced. So commas matter. What's the difference between 1 large diced shallot and 1 large shallot, comma, diced? Which do you think is more? So if you think about also cheese is a good example of this. If you say 1 cup of cheese, comma, shredded, versus 1 cup shredded cheese, those are 2 different amounts, if that makes sense. So you really need to focus on your commas and make sure that whatever you're trying to convey, whatever you want the reader to do, is easily understood. So again, also the beans are rinsed and drained. No salt or low sodium. Be as specific as you possibly can. Also with mint, comma, chopped. There's a big difference between a 1/4 cup of chopped mint and a 1/4 cup of mint, comma, chopped. Those are going to be 2 different amounts. So make sure you're paying attention to that when you are doing recipes as well. So now for the directions, the method matters. A lot of people don't know, depending on who your audience is, what deglazing is, or what tempering is, or what different items that you might have as cooking styles. People might not even know what braising is. So make sure that you use simple language, and if you put in something like deglazing, you explain what that is. So in here you can see in number 2, add the stock and deglaze the pan, comma, scraping up any brown bits and bring to a boil. So you're telling them to deglaze, but you're telling them how to do it. The other thing is always give a time and kind of a visual marker. So you can't just say saute. You can say saute until it's translucent for 2 to 3 minutes, because people want to know what they're visually looking for and then a time associated with it. I like to do things often where I'm starting with the action first. So in a bowl, in a pot, But you can, whatever you want to do, just be consistent. As long as it makes sense and it's understandable, you can kind of use the language you like, as long as you're comfortable with it and it's consistent and people understand. One other thing, things like chiffonade. You can say chiffonade, but I would suggest that you also put in which means thinly sliced into ribbons. Any kind of cooking terminology you're going to use, it's best to explain what that means. So we just talked about deglazing. Tempering is another one that people don't understand. If you're going to do, you're making like a holiday dessert. We're in the holiday season now. You're doing a dessert, you're making a custard, you have to temper the egg yolks. Explain what that means to somebody. Shredding cheese, basting, reducing sauce, all of these things that you might understand really easily, assume that people don't necessarily know what that is, and always give the information. Okay, nutrition facts. I don't include them on my website. They are in my book. It depends on you and what your feelings are about them. If you do include them, please use a reputable program or software. I use NutriBase. There's also Food Pro and a lot of other things, but using Calorie King or something like that, there's a lot of errors. So if you do choose to use nutrition facts, just make sure you're very clear about every point and that you're understanding how you do it. So for example, if you reduce a sauce, you should be weighing the sauce before and after, and that should be going into your nutrition facts. Because so if you have a cup of orange juice and you reduce it and it's 4 servings, that cup of orange juice is still a cup of orange juice. It didn't disappear. So those calories are still existent. So things like weighing before and after, raw versus cooked meat and poultry, these are all things you should be thinking about when you're doing nutrition facts. You can't just put in what the recipe ingredients are. You have to actually go through the cooking process as you write your nutrition facts. Okay, so we kind of have some recipe stuff and we want to go do some playing around in the kitchen, but how do we know what type of recipe to do and all these good things? So here are the things we need to think about. Just like when you're writing an article or a research paper, you should be thinking about all of these things for recipes. So where will it be found? Is it online on your blog? Is it on social media? Is it in the retail grocery store that you work in, a hospital, a university? All of these things. Think about who's going to be reading it where. Is there a focus? Is it you're doing something for diabetes clients? So it's a diabetes-based recipe. Are you doing it for the upcoming holidays? Is it a seasonal recipe for the fall? What is the focus and the target of the recipe itself? Who will use the recipe? Is it kids? Is it seniors because you work in a rehab facility or you deal with a lot of geriatric patients? All of these things, or is it a consumer at home? And then how complex or simple should it be? Are the people you're writing this for already in the kitchen and very comfortable, or are you trying to get them to come into the kitchen and try something out? So generally, good recipes are seasonally appropriate, easy and simple to follow, and approachable, well-tested, which we'll come back to. You can replicate them easily, and they're judicious with the number of ingredients and directions. So how many people do you think watch the Food Network and actually make any of the stuff they see there, right? I don't think that TV is made for people who are going to actually cook. So for us, as dietitians, we want people to cook, right? We want them in the kitchen. So try to keep it 10 ingredients or less. Try to make it easy to follow. You want someone to look at your recipe and say, okay, I can do this. I'm going to go make it now. I have all the ingredients. You don't want them to be scared and feel overwhelmed and not want to actually go and cook, right? So we want to make everything as approachable as possible. Okay, inspiration. So a lot of people ask me this. I kind of find inspiration everywhere. You just have to pay attention and really just think about food all the time. So obviously going out to eat, traveling, food magazines are all very good places to look. But I also do other things. I listen to friends and families and colleagues. So I have a daughter, and if I am talking to other parents and they'll say, oh, we haven't been able to do anything for breakfast. We don't know what to give our kids for breakfast. They're running out the door, blah, blah, blah. So then my idea is, all right, so maybe I need to do something geared towards families and kids that is a breakfast recipe. If you kind of think about what people talk to you about, those are good ways to start thinking of recipes or ways you're solving their problem, right? So a recipe can be a problem solver. If you're in grocery stores, kind of look and see what's on the shelves and if that gives you any ideas. Magazines that are not food magazines also often have good ideas, even just if you pay attention to the advertisements or what other things are going on. General disease states, if you work with diabetes or renal disease or cancer, anything in that population could be a good starting point to think about brainstorming for recipe ideas. Flavor profiles, so if you like Italian food, what are the general herbs and spices that are in Italian food? Or if you like Indian food, same thing there. If you make a recipe around turmeric, these are all ways to brainstorm recipe ideas. And then obviously farmers markets, food trends, which we're going to talk about now. Food trends, especially if you're on social media, we know that avocado toast is a huge thing, and smoothie bowls, and plant-based milk. If you look to trends, if you go to any food shows, if you get any of there's a lot of really good online food magazines that are business magazines that send out trends. Those are good emails to get also, just to give you some ideas. So maybe you've never really worked with oat milk and you decide you want to play around with that and do a recipe for that. These are all really good places to look for ideas. So here are some examples. Up on the upper left there, that's meatloaf that I made with some oats in it. So looking for something that's an unexpected ingredient. Maybe you're making meatloaf with oats. Maybe you're putting vegetables in your burgers, which I do a lot. Maybe you're doing risotto, but instead of doing risotto with rice, you're doing it with steel-cut oats. Like just some kind of unexpected twist to a basic classic recipe that you know people like. Maybe you're teaching about a food. So I have a savory oatmeal bowl up there on the upper right. So maybe you're talking about eggs. You really want to talk about eggs, and you're going to teach them how to fry or poach an egg, and you're going to do it in the format of a savory oatmeal bowl. Something that you want, maybe you like taking pictures, and you want to make things that look good, that will hold up well, so you can spend time taking pictures. So that could be kind of a focus of a recipe as well. Maybe you want to talk about the difference between steel-cut oats and rolled oats and instant oats. Apparently I'm on oats today. But then the whole purpose of your blog or your article might be about these are the 3 different types of oats, and here's a recipe for one of the types of oats. And then obviously as dietitians we can talk about food synergies. Maybe you're just going to do a simple recipe for sauteed kale with red pepper, but then you can talk about plant-based iron and how there's vitamin C and what that does and how it helps the uptake of iron and all of that. So your recipes don't just have to be food-focused as far as just for cooking. You can be teaching as well. Okay, testing. Oh, so how many of you have found recipes on the web and you look at them and you're like, oh, I'm going to make this sounds good, and you make it and it's terrible. A lot, see this is the problem with online, a lot of stuff isn't tested anymore. So I can look at a recipe now and know if it's going to work or not, but I also do a lot of stuff with cookbooks because everything in a cookbook is supposed to be tested a million times. So when I do my stuff, I will test at least 2 to 3 times, and then I will have other people test it and provide feedback. So this is the sheet that I use. So for the book, I had friends and they all took like 10 recipes and they tested everything and gave me these sheets. And when you're doing something over and over again, just like you're writing an article, you can't see it anymore. Once you've written it over and over again, and if you have tested a recipe yourself 2 or 3 times, you might not see things that someone else will see when they are testing it. Maybe you just left something out and you didn't even realize it, or maybe you didn't define a term and someone who doesn't cook that often will say, well, I don't know what this means and I didn't know what to do. So having other people test your recipes shows that they'll find stuff probably that you don't know was there, and then you'll know whether it works or not for people other than you. So then you'll feel good about what you're putting out there, and that other people will be able to see it and use it, and you're doing good work. Okay, so here's some examples of stuff that was in my book, so you can see how I do recipe development. I use hard copies for everything and then type it up later. So I do kind of a 3-color system. I don't know if you can see the colors up there, but I did avocado toast with smoked trout on it for my book. So generally I will brainstorm my ideas, I will write everything out what I think is going to be in the recipe in blue or black. And then you can see I did it once and I went through, you can see all the cross outs with the changes. I went back through and did it a second time, and that's in red, and I put different amounts, and then I have all my notes on the bottom. And then sometimes, and we'll see it in another one, I'll go back a 3rd time and it'll be another color entirely. So this, I did some granola. This took a little doing. So I list all my ingredients on the left and then my directions on the right. So that way, I know it's hard for you guys to read, but I understand what I'm doing here. So then I can group ingredients together and say, well, these 2 I sauteed first, then I added in this 3rd one, and then I did X, Y, and Z. So this is what my recipe development kind of looks like. And then this was the shrimp with white beans and feta, which I actually started out thinking it was going to be a sheet pan meal, and it was terrible. So I went back and then played around with sauteing it first and marinating it and then doing everything on the stove, and it came out so much better. So this one I think I did probably 4 times, and then I had 2 different people test it because I was worried that I was the only one that was able to do it. So, like you have to do stuff over and over again. It's not going to necessarily work the first time. Okay, copyright is something that a lot of people ask me questions about. So unfortunately, recipes you can't really copyright. Any list of ingredients is just seen as a list, so anyone can steal it. It's not, you can't copyright it, and the same with directions. The only hope you have to really copyright anything would be like a cookbook or a collection of recipes, and then even they really focus on the head notes and things necessarily more than the recipe. So if you have a restaurant, I know people say, well, that's our family recipe and whatever, and the food products, that's probably the only way you can really copyright a recipe. But your own, you can't really do much about. So if you are looking at other people's recipes and you want to make some changes to it and you are going to use it, it's important to say things like adapted from if you're making a small modification, or inspired by if you're making large modifications. Does everyone know Smitten Kitchen? That site, Smitten Kitchen? She does great stuff, but she always starts with someone else's recipe. And then she makes changes to it, some small, some large, but she always says adapted from or inspired by, for the most part. You can call it your own if you change 3 or more things. So 3 or more things doesn't have to be huge. You could go from a ½ teaspoon of salt to 1 teaspoon of salt. You could change the lemon juice to lime juice. You could, they're not really huge changes. So you can get away with taking someone else's recipe and doing 3 minor tweaks. However, ethically, that's another question. So I know it's really hard to do, but sometimes it's better for you to write out a list of brainstorming ideas. So you really like blueberry muffins, but what are some ways that you could try to do blueberry muffins that are your own? Maybe you're going to do something with oats in it. Maybe you're going to do gluten-free. Maybe you're going to do almond flour. make a list of all the things that you could do to a blueberry muffin to make it different, and then start to play around in the kitchen and look at other recipes as a base to work off of, rather than finding a recipe and then just doing that and making little tweaks. That's it. That was pretty fast. I'm here for the food and culinary professionals, by the way, so if you are part of their DPG, they're pretty awesome. And also, Nancy asked me to talk about the Iowa Egg Council quickly. I heard there's a recipe contest, so you guys should all enter. Yeah, and any questions? You can ask me about whatever. Yeah.
I'd love to hear more about your cookbook and how long it took you to develop it and what sort of recipes are in it and where people can get it. Anything you want to talk about your book?
Thank you. It was a Mediterranean DASH diet. So it is the DASH diet, low sodium, a lot of herbs and spices, but with a Mediterranean style of cooking. It took me 6 weeks to do it, which was not my choice, but the publisher's choice. So I have a woman who works for me, and so she came and cooked with me for 12 hours, 3 days a week for 6 weeks. Before that, I had gone through and worked out all the chapters and how many recipes and what my recipes were going to be on a brainstorm basis. And then she would come over and we would essentially, she'd prep everything. I would write a list of what I wanted, and she would prep everything, and I would just cook. And then on the weekends, I wrote all the head notes and did all the nutrition facts and wrote the first chapter. That's all about the Mediterranean DASH diet. And then I had dinner parties, and people came over and ate everything, and my doorman ate everything, and my daughter and friends ate everything. And then I had like 10 friends test all the recipes. But it was a lot. And you can order it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, I think some private, like independent booksellers. I don't know if it's in brick and mortar yet. It should be eventually, but it's on Amazon now for sure.
I have 2 questions.
Yeah.
Do you do all of your own food photography, or do you have someone else do that? And then, is this your full-time job?
Yes, it's my full-time job. I've had my own business for 5 years. The first year, I was fully on my own. The second and third, I did per diem at Hospital for Special Surgery just to keep me afloat as I kind of figured out what I was selling and who was buying. And, sorry, what was your first question?
Do you do your own food photography?
Oh, food photography. So, all right, I do a whole other presentation about some of this stuff. We can't be all things, right? So everyone wants us to be recipe developers, food photographers, dietitians, but nobody's perfect at everything. I feel like we all have a scale of what we're good at in different levels. Food photography is my low one. So I do some of my own, but it makes me very anxious. And I live in New York City, so my lighting is pretty terrible. So I film videos every month with a professional team. So he takes all we have a photographer who does all the photos while I'm filming. And then I have a woman I work with if I really want. So a lot of brands now like bright and white and cheery. So I have one woman who does that really well, who's a food photographer, and she does that. And then everything else I do, but not as much, no.
So when you were developing recipes for your cook, did you have a certain sodium content you were looking for, or what guidelines did you try to stick to for your Mediterranean DASH? Sure.
In general, my rule of thumb is usually the sodium should be not more than double the calories. Does that make sense? But for the DASH, I went through when I was doing the first chapter and I kind of outlined what I wanted it to be. So my entrees are no more than 570 milligrams and my desserts and sides I think are 250.
Were you a dietitian first, or a chef, or a chef first, and a dietitian, or what made you interested in both sides?
The short to medium version. So I was in hotelity at Cornell, where we had to do a lot of cooking, and it was the business school, but we did all hospitality-based businesses. So I ended up getting interested in nutrition then because we were cooking French style, and I thought, well, this isn't sustainable. So I took nutrition when I was a freshman. It was like me and like 2,000 pre-med students, and I thought it was really interesting and great, but didn't want to switch my major. So I did consulting, like hospitality consulting for a long time, and then always kept going back to nutrition. In 2000, I went to culinary school instead of my MBA. I worked in restaurants for a few years, which was also pretty rough. So I ended up in 2007 saying, I'm leaving finance and corporate and all that, and went back and got my master's in nutrition then. And when I was doing that, I realized a lot of dietitians don't actually cook or have any culinary background. So that is when I made it kind of my niche.
Any blogs that you follow that you recommend?
So for online stuff, I try to look at things that are like people who do a good job. So I do a lot of the magazine, I follow the magazines, Eating Well and I'm Curious and all of that usually do really well. Smitten Kitchen, she does a really good job. Honestly, like it's not a lot because like even ones that are big and very popular, which I won't say, but you can look at their recipes and their ingredients are out of order or their directions don't make sense. So I find it hard to do a lot of the online stuff. Pinch of Yum usually does a really nice job. Anyone who actually has a culinary background usually does a pretty nice job. Any other questions? No? No other questions? Okay. Well, thank you.